Hello, this is Jimmy. Welcome to the first episode of my Why I Bought It series. In this series I'm going to be talking about the gear that I purchased, and rather than do a review, which there are already plenty of on YouTube, what I want to do is talk more about how I made the decision of why to buy a particular piece of gear rather than another one. There's a lot of choices out there, and I think the really important part is not what you ultimately choose, but the process that you use to decide what to purchase, how you decide, okay, here are the features I need to consider. How do I compare this versus that? How do I choose a brand? How do I narrow down this incredible scope of the decisions I have to make? So I'm going to talk to you in my first video about the Canon 800D, which is the DSLR camera that I decided on as I started photography. This is known as the Rebel T7i in America, 800D internationally, and the KISS series in Japan. Which is probably a pretty small part of my audience, so I won't be using those names. I think it's easier to understand when you use the consistent digits followed by a D name for the entire Canon line rather than switching names based on which region you're in. So the first choice I had to make when I was looking for a camera is, do I want to get a DSLR or the newer mirrorless type of camera? So this is kind of an interesting time that we're in for digital cameras, where mirrorless is this new technology that replaces the traditional mirror that DSLRs use to reflect the light in, bounce off a mirror and into the viewfinder to give you, through the viewfinder, exactly what the image sensor is going to capture, versus a new model that uses an electronic viewfinder. So it's similar to the way that the live display works on cameras with an LCD screen, and it just uses that same technology of capturing what the image sensor sees and actually displaying it electronically in the viewfinder to eliminate the need for a mirror. And the result is that there's no moving parts when you take a picture, because normally the mirror has to flip up for the light to hit the image sensor, and that causes a little bit of shake, which can be a problem if you're trying to hold very still to take an image. As a result of not having the mirror, the camera can be physically smaller, which is generally something that people want. Smaller is generally better unless you have really big hands and you need a good, heavy, sturdy grip. So in my initial research for this, I have to admit that I didn't really understand the benefits of mirrorless quite as well as I do now. And in particular, then the most embarrassing thing, which I have to admit, because that's really what this channel is about, is I didn't understand that electronic viewfinder meant the viewfinder and not the LCD panel. So when I was originally reading about mirrorless cameras, my understanding was that it essentially did away with the viewfinder and you had only the LCD screen, which of course doesn't make much sense. And if that was the case, I think a lot of people wouldn't go for it. First of all, because this LCD screen has brightness to it. So if you're trying to take pictures in a dark place, where you don't want to be conspicuous, then that's obviously not going to work very well. So that was my silly misunderstanding that at the beginning I basically ruled out mirrorless because I was thinking, no, I want a viewfinder, that's not going to work for me. And it was only a little bit later when I realized, oh, wait a minute, electronic viewfinder refers to actually the viewfinder. So it's been, over the last few years, kind of a developing technology. Sony is the brand that is generally kind of agreed upon to be the market leader in mirrorless cameras. I decided, partly because of my not great understanding of it, and partly just to be on the safer side, that I was going to stick with a traditional DSLR. So that was the first sort of decision that I made. Mirrorless being new, I wanted to wait for the dust to settle, have a little bit of better competition between the major manufacturers of digital cameras. Otherwise it was pretty much Sony was the best and most obvious choice for a mirrorless camera. I decided I was going to go with DSLR. The next choice that I had to make is brand. And while a more experienced photographer might have chosen brand based on what cameras were available, for someone who's new and someone who is very overwhelmed by all the choices and possibilities and the very detailed spec sheets of all of these cameras that are out there, it was actually easier to start at the brand level and kind of narrow things down there, because it can be kind of a difficult challenge to understand even a single camera manufacturer's product lines and decide among their products which are you going to go with. So I read a bit of advice online that said, if you're brand new and you're buying a camera and you don't know which brand to go with, first of all all digital cameras today are incredibly powerful, and you're going to be able to take amazing pictures with whatever you choose, even the very lowest of any camera manufacturer's line. If you consider that these are all cameras that are years of technology more advanced than the cameras that the most famous photographs of all time were used for. So you really couldn't go wrong, and you're not going to necessarily really regret any decision you make regardless of what you do. So that's sort of comforting, and to know that you can't really go too wrong just because the baseline of quality from all cameras these days are really quite good. The other thing that I read about how you choose a brand is basically the menuing system has a lot to do with it. The cameras have sort of a different navigation system in their internal menus and where the controls are on the camera. And a good way to pick a camera model, or a camera manufacturer rather, is to try out a few and see which menu system feels the most natural to you, that you can learn the most quickly and not have to think about where the controls you need are. And the last way to pick is to think about people that you know, friends or family. Do any people that you know who are photographers or have some photography equipment have a particular brand? If they do, or if they have a preference, it may be a good idea for you to pick the same kind that they're using for any possibility of exchanging tips or even equipment. Maybe you'll get some hand-me-downs from their equipment once they don't need something anymore. That can be very valuable to you. So those bits of advice that I got online are kind of what I use to steer myself to Canon for the manufacturer that I was going to choose. As I've learned more about sort of the landscape of digital cameras, I think Canon probably has the sort of weakest reputation right now amongst professional photographers, and that's because they're really just not cutting edge at the moment. Sony has really been at the forefront of developing the newest and most powerful camera technology in the last few years, and the general consensus is that Canon and Nikon, the other major camera manufacturer, are kind of playing catch-up at this point, and if you really want the best of the best, then Sony is the way to go. But that's not to say that the cameras from these other manufacturers are not plenty good for what a beginner is going to need. And as someone who didn't really know the difference between all these subtle changes in ability between these cameras, it just really didn't matter so much, and it was more important for me to get something that was familiar and something that was perhaps interoperable with camera that my brother was using. So my brother is also a photographer. He does largely architecture photography, and he's been using Canon gear for about 10 years. He started with a Rebel series like I did, and then later moved on to the Canon EOS 60D, which is the older version of what is currently the 80D. It's kind of the mid-tier. So I decided I was going to do Canon because it was what I was familiar with from years past using their point-and-shoot cameras. I had a couple of different Canon PowerShot cameras in the early 2000s. And so I decided Canon was going to be what I was going to go with. Once I decided on the brand, I had to figure out their lineup of models. And Canon does not make this easy for you. It's actually quite confusing to figure out exactly how their lines of cameras interleave. The model names are very confusing, and which one is best is not necessarily limited to which particular line you're going to choose, because they have very long product cycles. And so sometimes a newer camera on a lower line, or sort of a lower tier, is actually a better choice than a higher tier from an older model, because the new technology gets introduced in the newest thing and not necessarily the highest thing. So basically the way it breaks down is that Canon has DSLR line and a mirrorless line, and they've since introduced a new mirrorless line since I bought my 800D. So I'm going to leave the Canon EOS R out of my discussion because that didn't exist at the time that I bought this in early summer of 2018. So at the time what I had to choose from was the EOS digital cameras and the M series, which was their previous mirrorless lineup. And as I mentioned before, mirrorless was not really something that I was looking at this point. So it was really down to the EOS DSLR lineup. Even there's kind of a confusing pattern to their model lines. But basically all of their models go by model numbers that are a number followed by the letter D. And there's a line that has 4 digits followed by a D, 3 digits followed by a D, 2 digits followed by a D, and 1 digit followed by a D. And they are increasing in the tier of product line as the number shrinks. So the ones that have 4 and 3 numbers, so that would be like 1000D or 100D, those are sort of the entry-level lineup, the ones that go by the Rebel name in the United States. And that's generally like the most common digital camera. You probably have seen them before. You've probably even heard the name EOS Rebel, if you're not, even if you're not familiar with photography very much. They're pretty common. They're very popular entry-level cameras. And of course, this is what I ended up going with. And then the second lineup is the 2 digits. So that's 60D, 70D, 80D. And these are kind of mid-range cameras. The body is a little bit more sturdy. They have a little bit more in terms of external controls. They have an LCD screen on the top of the camera over here, which my camera lacks, as you can see. So there's a little bit more flexibility, be a little bit more rugged. I believe it has weather sealing that's a little bit better, but ultimately the internals of the camera are pretty much the same. And finally, we have the single digit series. So that's the Canon 1D is their very flagship top of the line, which of course was way out of what I was considering. And then the more common and more popular cameras are the Canon 5D, the 6D, and the 7D. And to understand the differences between all of these different ones, the other really important distinction is the size of the sensor. This is something that I had to learn about at the beginning. So the sort of the default size for a camera sensor is called full frame. And this means that the sensor is equivalent to 35 millimeter film. So measurements that are given for sensor size and lenses that attach and the focal length of lenses that attach to a camera are usually referred to in 35 millimeter equivalent terms. So full frame is kind of the default size for a digital sensor on a digital camera. The lower, slightly less expensive digital cameras use one of a few different types of reduced sensor sizes that are generally referred to as cropped sensor or cropped frame. And on a cropped sensor, the physical sensor on the camera that absorbs the light when you take a picture is physically smaller. So there's less space on the sensor, it captures less data, and ultimately you have a smaller image. So the resolution will be a little bit smaller, and the low light performance is not quite as good. But there is actually one advantage, or two advantages really. One is that it's cheaper, and the second advantage is that you actually get a little bit of zoom factor. So because of the way that the lenses for 35 millimeter equivalent full frame cameras work on the crop sensor, it has the result of magnifying your field of view. So if you were to use, for example, like a 50 millimeter lens that was intended for a full frame camera and put that on a crop sensor camera, it's actually the equivalent of about 80 to 85 millimeters. So you have a slightly zoomed in field of view. Things are a little bit more telephoto when you're using a crop sensor. When you're trying to get a lot of things in an image, it's generally not a good thing. So if you're trying to do really wide angle things, or you're inside, say an indoor space and you're trying to capture an entire room, it can be a bad thing if you're suddenly more zoomed in than you want it to be. But in certain situations, it's actually very useful, such as when you're intentionally doing a long telephoto shot. So for that reason, a lot of wildlife photographers will prefer a crop sensor camera because they get that extra little bit of zoom to get closer to the animals that they're trying to shoot. In my case, the extra zoom wasn't really a major factor in what I was considering. It was really more just about the price and about me as a new photographer. Is it really worth me bumping up to full frame, which seemed like a more sort of professionally targeted product? And I just didn't know enough to know whether that was something that would matter for me. So this other bit of advice that I got that was really useful from my brother, actually, I've got to credit him for this, is I said, when I see all these different lines, like, how do I know which one I'm going to get? And his general advice was, if you read the specs and you don't know what they mean, that's a good sign that you don't need any difference in improvement. So essentially, get something that's as good as you can understand why it's good, and by the time you understand why you would have gotten a better one, that's a signal that you know enough to make that purchase for a better camera. which seemed like pretty safe buying advice, and I think that's probably good advice for purchasing any piece of technology or really any sort of product decision, is don't pay for something that you don't understand or pay for something that's beyond the capabilities that you know you need at the time you do. Now, that's not to say that it's not a good idea to understand a little bit beyond what you need, because there is the risk that you could outgrow what you have very quickly, in which case you'll want to get something better right away and you will have wasted all this money on something that was not quite up to par with what you needed. So there is a balancing act there, like anything else. But I think in general it's safe advice to say don't pay a lot more for something that you don't understand the benefits of. And that's exactly how I ended up with the Canon 800D or T7i. This, at the time I purchased it, was the, and it still is, the most recent in the Canon Rebel lineup. So this is essentially the high end of Canon's low end DSLR. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, Canon has product cycles for each of these tiers of cameras that is much longer than what I'm used to in the computer technology industry, where very often manufacturers are releasing a new version of each model every year, and you don't have to wait very long to get the new version of something. It's usually much more practical to wait for the latest version of a computer to be released before making a purchase. And at any given time, if you decide you want a new computer, it's usually not too hard to wait until the next product release. That's not quite the same with cameras, or at least from Canon, which can have anywhere from a 4 to 6 year product cycle before the next revision of the same line is introduced. So the sort of most popular full-frame camera from Canon is the 5D, and they're currently on the 4th revision of that. So the 5D Mark IV is the current generation of their top-end professional grade camera, excluding the 1D flagship level, which is beyond what most people use. The 5D is only revamped about every 4 years, and right now we're about 2 years into its product cycle, so it's going to be at least another year or so until we see a revision to the 5D. And as a result, there's other cameras in Canon's line that are on a lower tier that are actually better in terms of image processor and some features like the flippy LCD screen that's articulating. This used to be sort of a power feature and is now becoming standard on even the lower line of Canon cameras. And yet the 5D still doesn't have this. It has an older image processor in it than some of the newer lower end cameras. So this was something that is very different from the way you purchase computers and those kinds of technology products. So in addition to choosing the right line, I also had to consider which has the newest technology for the current generation, being late 2018. What's the most recent technology I can get, regardless of where it stacks vertically on the tier of Canon models. And for that, I decided on the 800D. This uses the Digic 7 processor, which is, up until the EOS R, which was released a few months later, the current generation and most modern image processor in a camera, which even the 5D Mark IV doesn't have. The only other cameras that had this processor at the time that I purchased this were the 6D Mark II, which is sort of the full frame equivalent of this, and the 77D. The 77D is kind of a slight upgrade in the mid-range model. So the 80D doesn't have this processor, while the 77D, which is technically a little bit lower tier, does. It's all very confusing. One thing that I found extremely useful in visualizing this sort of generational change of Canon's models is actually if you go on Wikipedia and you navigate to the article about a comparison between Canon EOS digital cameras, there's not only a very large chart that shows a breakdown of all the details of each individual model, but there's a great little sort of horizontal bar chart at the bottom of the page that shows the lifeline of each of these camera models and the cycles at which they're updated, how they stack in terms of tier, and also when the camera processor is updated, and of course the years as the timeline goes on. So taking a look at this table, you can see very clearly what is the current generation of technology, regardless of which tier it's in, and how important that is in comparison to getting a higher tier that may be early or middle in its product cycle, or worse yet, late in its product cycle when you know a new one is coming, but it's not quite here yet and you don't know exactly when it's coming. So from this, I was able to narrow down that I wanted one that had the latest image processor, that had the flippy screen, which is very useful for taking videos or taking photos where your camera is very low to the ground or above your head, because you can rotate the screen and you're able to see without straining your neck or lying on your stomach or doing some sort of crazy acrobatics like that in order to get the picture. And sure enough, the vari-angle screen has been extremely useful, and I can't imagine having used a camera without it. So I think that was a really significant factor in why I purchased the 800D. That's pretty much all of the factors that led me to buy the Canon 800D. It's been very dependable. I really have no complaints about it at all. The only thing that I think I would have chosen if I had researched it longer is I might have gone for the 60 Mark II, which is sort of like the full frame equivalent of this in terms of its features and sort of generational technology. It's got the same image processor as this Canon 800D. It's got the vari-angle screen, which is very good for taking videos and, as I said, from taking photos from different angles. It's got a more rugged body and weather sealing and all that. And most significantly, it's just a full frame camera, so you'll be able to get the more expensive and more professional Canon L series lenses, which for some reason are only targeted at the full frame lineup. So the 60 Mark II is probably what I would have gotten. And as it turns out, a bit later in the year, almost towards 2019, I came into some extra money and I decided that I was going to get the 60 Mark II. And in fact, that is what this video is being filmed on right now. So it's actually worked out in the last week or so great for having the 800D and the 60 Mark II at the same time. I can now use one for photos and one for video at the same time, and it's really the best of both worlds. A few of the lenses I can share between the cameras, and when I go on a trip, I can choose between getting the extra telephoto range if I'm shooting wildlife by using the crop sensor camera, and when I need lower light or my higher quality lenses, I can use the 60 Mark II. So after all of this, I've been explaining why I chose the 800D and generally recommending it for a beginner purchase, and then I dropped this on you that I got the 60 Mark II anyway. So in a sense, this is kind of like what I was saying earlier, that it's a little bit dangerous to get something that's just barely at the edge of your understanding, because it might be quickly obsoleted, or your needs might be expanded so quickly that you end up quickly replacing what you bought. And to an extent, that's what happened to me. But I will say that there's really nothing wrong with this camera, and the only reason that I got the 60 Mark II is because I got this extra money that I was not expecting to get and that I was able to spend rather than save. So it's really kind of a luxury item that I got. I was planning to wait longer before upgrading to full frame, and I really think that I would have been just fine if I didn't get this 60 Mark II. I'd be very happy, and in fact, as I said, I plan to continue using the 800D probably for many years to come. So this is a great camera. I'm really not sorry at all that I purchased it. I've been able to take all of my photos of 2018 with this, and came out with some really wonderful pictures that I was very happy with. The great thing now about having the 60 Mark II, though, is that it does give me a full frame camera that will hold me over until Canon releases a second or maybe third generation of their EOS R camera lineup, which is their new mirrorless camera system to rival the Sony Alpha series, which has generally been the most popular. And I wanted a full frame camera once I understood a little bit better about what the benefits were. But I still wasn't quite ready for a mirrorless camera, and even with the release of Canon's EOS R, I really think that it's not a good idea to buy a first generation product. Things get improved so rapidly, and usually the difference between a first and a second generation product is really significant in getting out all of the kinks of that first series that has been released without feedback from the public. So the 60 Mark II is a great camera. Also, I'll do a video on that later. But I think it's going to be, the combination of these two, of the 800D and the 60 Mark II, are going to be more than enough for me, and they're going to hold me over really well until I inevitably get a mirrorless camera in the future when the products are a bit more refined. But thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.